Pac-Man for the original Nintendo Game Boy can be played in two different flavors. The default view that allows you to explore the game in its proper full resolution with additional scrolling to compensate for the Game Boy's small screen, or you could play the full screen option, toggled by pressing left or right on the title screen, that shrinks the playfield down to a miniature size so that you can see the whole maze, as was the case with the original arcade game that this was based on. Whichever way works in the long run, they both function rather well, and the zoomed in view adds a slight degree of challenge harkening back to the days of Junior Pac-Man. But otherwise, it's not a huge detriment, and if you're not comfortable with this style of play, then you can always play it full screen mode and it works too. Despite everything being miniature, it's still plainly visible and it's still playable on any Game Boy unit. Aside from that, this Game Boy iteration of Pac-Man looks fairly close to the arcade original. The full-size sprites are simplistically drawn, the background's white instead of black, and the ghosts all have the same shade of gray instead of different distinct shades, but they're all almost on par with what you'd get on a home port such as the NES or whatnot. Everything moves and flows at a brisk pace that doesn't blur all that much on the Game Boy screen. Of course, some will bring up the argument that the game's a bit slow in comparison to the arcade game, or maybe even other ports, but personally I think it's alright for what it is for the most part. I think the fact that all four ghosts are all the same shade does add a slight degree of challenge to the game, since each ghost had specific patterns and characteristics independent of each other. However, if you study these patterns, then it shouldn't be a huge problem, and they did try to ease up the challenge a bit by eliminating some dots here and there, most notably on the top of the maze. So there's fewer dots to chomp on in this version. It's not a huge adjustment, however, and it still plays about as well as any other handheld Pac-Man for that matter. Controls tight and responsive, no real complaints in that department, and aside from color and a few dots, not a whole lot's sacrificed for this port. Intermissions are there, jingles are there, gameplay is pretty much what you expect from Pac-Man, so in that regard, it's still very much Pac-Man. Even the overall sound quality is quite impressive. Sure, some of the sounds are a couple pitches off and aren't exactly arcade perfect such as it is, but they did try their best in coming close, and in that regard, it's ultimately passable sound. Overall, Game Boy owners were well served with a solid conversion of the original Pac-Man. The ghost of a single shade and fewer dots aside, this is Pac-Man as you almost remember him, and it's a pretty decent conversion for the Game Boy. Not a bad job all things considered, and worth a look if you have an old black and white Game Boy laying around and enjoy Pac-Man in general. Now there is a color version for the Game Boy Color that was released several years later, but I don't have that version so I can't comment on that one. This black and white version, however, is not that bad.